Okay, so it looks like we've had fewer folks coming in, so hopefully we've got a quorum at least at this point. So I'll go ahead and get us started. Welcome to the first virtual sensory session for the WRE. This is obviously not the way we normally do things, but we're trying a number of different ways to continue to communicate information from the various experiments from this year. And for this particular experiment, we wanted to make sure to get some good sensory data. So thank you guys for being part of that. Hopefully you received all of your little bottles of wine and were able to kind of sign into the sensory spreadsheet there and put in your answers. And we will decode that for you in a few minutes here. Just as we're getting started, just to give you an idea of kind of what the plan, such as it is for the WRE at this point, most of you know at this point we would normally be doing sensory sessions every 2 weeks. That's not going to be possible for the remainder of our time until the end of May. But we will be trying to address, again, getting you guys information is in a number of different ways. So you probably have noticed that there's been sort of an uptick in the frequency of newsletters. As soon as basically the first thing we did is just make sure to get chemistry information from as many experiments as possible. And I've been writing those up into reports as best as I can. There are a number of experiments that in conjunction with the winemaker, we sort of tasted those wines together and kind of said there's not a big sensory difference here. So a lot of those wines will probably just be, or those experiments will sort of just be rolled out through newsletters, through one-on-one chats that I'll start doing with winemakers next week. And that sort of a venue. If there does seem to be a sensory difference, we're trying to sort of capture those wines, either having them kept separate over vintage if they were over vintage wines, or getting bottled samples of those before they bottle, with the hope that sometime in the near future, maybe in November or December, through the VVA or the VWA meeting or through some additional sensory sessions, that we can present those to you, particularly the ones that do have some differences. Depending on how things go today and how this sort of thing works, we might try this with a couple of other ones of those experiments as well. So just sort of keeping an eye on those sorts of things. Right now, again, we're trying to be responsive to the situation while still making sure that we honor all of the hard work that was done by our participants and make sure that everybody gets to hear the results of those experiments and learn from them. So before we kind of jump into our experiment for the day today, just a couple of logistics for this format. So this is a meeting format and not a webinar format, and that means that you have control of your own microphone. So thank you to everybody for muting yourselves as you're coming in. And I would say that just to sort of cut down on the ambient noise, while we're kind of doing the initial presentation of the experiment, how it was conducted, what those chemistry results were. If you can stay muted, that would be great. If you have a question that you're like, needs to be answered right then to be able to follow in, for example, if I forget to explain something and you need some explanation, feel free to unmute yourself and chime in. If you have just a question that can wait until later on, you can feel free to kind of write that into the chat box, and we'll make sure to address that after we kind of reconvene this way without the slides in the way as well. Once we get into talking about sensory though, I would love for you to unmute yourselves and participate in the discussion of what your sensory analysis was for those wines. So that also being said, if hopefully you received all of your wine samples in good order, were able to do your own at-home sensory analysis and put those things into the spreadsheet. If you haven't had a chance to taste the wines yet, I would highly recommend that you actually kind of do that now and then come back and join us so that so that your sensory impressions are as uninformed as we want them to be for a blind sensory analysis. So with that, can everybody see and hear? Is the technology piece of that working before we jump in? Good? All right. Okay, great. Well, it is. So today's topic is looking at the effect of crop load on grape ripening and wine quality in Merlot. And I've got a number of special guests that I'm going to be sort of calling in to our time together. So this was an experiment that was done at Trump Winery. So Joseph Geller was the one that brought the idea to the WRE to begin with, and Jonathan Wheeler was part of that. It did include some vineyard experimental design parameters that were beyond the scope of my education or knowledge. And so we asked Tim Jordan, who has his PhD from Virginia Tech, to come in and help with designing the setup of the treatments in the vineyard, and also to handle the statistical analysis that came on the backside of that. So we will be bringing them all into the discussion as well as we get started. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you. So let's see. I don't know how this works when I get to. Okay, so hopefully you can see the front slide here. Is that looking right? I can't see anybody now. So look good? All right. So the first question, yeah, okay, thanks. So just to sort of give a tiny bit of background here, you know, the first thing that we might want to address is just why do a crop load study? Don't we already know that lower crop load leads to better quality wine and higher crop load leads to poorer quality wine? Well, as I do with any of these, when we start out, I kind of look in the literature and say, what do we already know from published studies of this? Now, I'm not going to read you this whole table, but this is just a quick little smattering of some of the work that's been done on crop load in the past. If you want to sort of get any of this information, I've dropped a link to the place where this is posted on the WRE website as well, so you can kind of look at this in more detail if you want to. But as you can see, there's a lot of different studies that have been done, and it turns out that they didn't all come up with the same conclusion. So if we do kind of a quick recap of that, it turns out that the effect of crop load on wine quality, and a lot of these are just in grapes, so on grape parameters, have really mixed results. So there are some studies that certainly do show that you get better Brix accumulation with a lower crop load, but some studies sort of out the fact that Brix accumulation can often be made up just with extra hang time. So in a situation and in a growing region where you can just sort of hang it longer, that's fine. Some places, though, by hanging it longer, we incur additional risk. So, for example, risk of a hurricane coming, or increased disease pressure, or pests, or in some areas, the weather is going to get cold and you're not going to have the opportunity to accumulate those Brix. But again, there are plenty of studies that don't show a difference in Brix accumulation with pretty different crop loads. So a lot of these studies, when we look at them, we also have to realize that they're often looking at a difference of very, very big differences in crop load, and you don't see that difference in Brix accumulation, for example, until you get to very high crop loads. So the study that we'll look at today, we're looking at a difference between 3 and 4.5 tons to the acre. And a lot of these studies don't start to see differences until you get to like 8 or 10 tons to the acre. So interpreting those in light of our practical question becomes important. Another thing that we see in these studies is that sometimes we see differences, but they're not consistent from year to year. So you might see a difference in one year and not in another. And again, thinking about that from the point of view of Virginia, you may have seen a difference in 2018 and not 2019, for example, because we had very different growing conditions in those 2 years. There was a study in California looking at Cabernet Sauvignon where it actually, the wine quality was considered to be worse in the lower crop load because there was an additional perception of vegetal quality, and their argument was that basically methoxypyrazine didn't have as many places to go, and so in the end you got more methoxypyrazine for a particular crop load, and that again we know some things about high crop load with methoxypyrazine, but apparently, at least according to that study, we need to be careful with having too low of a crop load as well. I lost there we go. And then, so sort of taken as a whole, it looks like in a lot of these cases, there's sort of this, what I have come to think of as like a range of acceptable values. So there's some sort of too low that might be bad, and there's some too high that might be bad, but there's this sort of space in the middle where it seems like most of the parameters being measured are about the same. And so in terms of thinking about managing the vineyard and managing our wine production for that, maybe the idea would be making sure to stay on that plateau, but for financial reasons, sometimes maybe not being on the too low side of that. But with everything, in most of these studies, they're looking at general wine parameters or general grape parameters like Brix, pH, and TA. But as winemakers, we know that that doesn't tell the whole story at all about wine quality. So we're interested in grape quality as it pertains to wine quality. And so much of what we think about in quality wines are beyond Brix, pH, and TA. So thinking about phenolic development and thinking about the development of flavors and aromas along the way. So as I was doing my research for this particular background information, I came across a study that Bruce Zoklin did in I think the late 1990s. That was posted on his enology notes, and I already dropped a PDF of that into the chat here. But because Bruce had already signed up to be on the call, I asked Bruce if he would be willing to tell us a little bit about what he did during that study and what they found, because I think it was a really good indication of looking at some parameters beyond just Brix, pH, and TA. So Bruce, would you be willing to tell us a little bit about that study?
Sure. This was actually begun in the early 90s when there was the universal question as to what is the relationship between crop level and wine quality. There was presumed that that relationship was inverse, but there was really no definitive data for a whole host of reasons, none the least of which is the fact that it's fairly complex subject. So we did a number of studies, one of which is illustrated here on the left. We took Chardonnay grapes and we cropped it at the levels that I think you can almost read. That's 3.7, 7.3, and 10.2 tons per acre. We harvested that at one date. And as you can see, we got the results that are fairly predictable. At a set harvest date, the Brix values are different, and of course, they follow a logical pattern. The pH is about the same among treatments, and of course, those letters across the top reflect the significant differences. The sugar per berry, total phenols, flavonoid phenols, and total glycosides were all higher in the lower crop level. This was fairly predictable. The total glycosides there at the end are a concentration of the estimation of the pool of the combined secondary metabolites, many of which are aroma and flavor compounds. And that data is expressed on a gram of fresh fruit weight basis to offset the variation in berry size. So wine quality, as you might expect, was wildly different than these three treatments. That's not really the question. The question is, what would happen if you let the high crop load, that is to say the 10.2 tons per acre, hang on the vine and come up to the, say, 23.2 Brix that we saw in the low crop treatment? Would that make a difference? In other words, does crop level simply delay maturity, or are there qualitative differences in the grape components that would indeed affect wine components? Why don't you go back one slide if you can, and I'll address this, the issues of the glycosides. Those of you that followed the work that we did, particularly in the early 90s, know that we did a lot of work on grape glycosides, developed some methodologies. This slide just illustrates the three different components of glycosides that we looked at, and I'll bring this up only because it'll help to explain some subsequent data. The total glycosides are the total pool of these secondary metabolites, which include aroma and flavor components, also anthocyanins. We also looked at phenol-free glycosides, which, as the name would imply, separate out all of the phenolic components. And as you can see there in the center, we looked at red-free glycosides as a means of being able to kind of hone down on which glycosides would be affected by this crop load treatment. Okay, next slide. So this is a study, this is part of a different study where we looked at the relationship between crop level and this glycosides that are depicted here again on a per berry basis over varying degrees of Brix. And it illustrates a primary point, and that is that there is a positive relationship between glycosides and wine quality. The higher the glycoside content, the greater the wine quality. So the question is, if we hang the fruit at this higher crop level, will that crop level produce the same quantity of glycosides eventually so as to make wine quality that is similar? And this shows the change in glycosides that occur over time. And generally, the answer to that question is it depends on the length of time that it takes for those high crop levels to catch up to the low crop level. The longer the time period, the less is going to be the correlation between the high crop level quality and the low crop level quality. That is essentially depicted in this slide here. The lower crop level has a higher glycoside content, but as you can see, for the lower Brixes, it's not that significantly different. Where it really matters is when we go to a higher level of maturity. Next slide. So here is another study. Let's see, this is on Cabernet Sauvignon. And we had two crop levels. Actually, we had three, but this slide just shows the two, the high and the low. And at the top there, you can see what we've got. And this just shows that they were harvested at two different dates, by the way. That slide is a little confusing, but they were harvested at what was a relatively standard Brix value in the 90s, and that was 20.5. And this slide simply shows the components that were statistically or significantly different. And you can see that there are some differences, but they're not very acute. So the question, so did the wine quality result in anything that was particularly different? No, it didn't. But the real question is, what happens if we let that fruit hang to the more modern day Brix values? And that's what's really depicted on the bottom slide here. And this bottom slide shows the relationship between the glycoside concentration and the correlation over time at both the high and the low crop treatments. And as you can see, we've interposed also leaf pulling and non-leaf pulling. I guess the point is very simple, and that is that as you get to higher Brix levels, the differences in glycosides between the low and the high crop treatment become greater naturally. What also becomes greater is the time that it takes for the high crop level to, even with additional hang time, to get to the same Brix as the low crop level. And the longer that period is, the less is the correlation between the high crop wine quality and the low crop wine quality. So I think that's probably all the slides you have. All of this is to suggest a couple of things in our research, and that is that the time that it takes to reach a targeted Brix value is, of course, positively correlated with yield. The total glycosides are a positive correlation with Brix and wine quality. but only really at Brix values that are greater than about 20.5. And the total and phenolic free glycoside concentrations and wine quality are negatively correlated with the time it takes to reach a targeted Brix, notably a Brix value that is greater than 20. So if we extrapolate what's happening now, of course, this glycoside work that we did was experimental, even though we got the glycoside analysis down to be semi-automated because we were running so many of them. It was still not an analysis that could easily be conducted by commercial labs. But it did spur some interest in some other work that is currently undergoing, which tracks along the very, very same lines. And that the bottom line of that work is to suggest that, like glycosides, anthocyanins can be used as a measure of a correlation between crop level and wine quality, but not quantitatively. That is to say, it's not the concentration of anthocyanins. It's more a matter of the fact that if you harvest at the point of time thereafter where the anthocyanin level has peaked, that is to say, the anthocyanin plateau, there's a correlation, a positive, strong correlation between that anthocyanin plateau and red wine quality. And because of some additional algorithms that have been created to be able to measure these, measure anthocyanins more easily, more and more commercial labs are sort of expounding on some of the work that we did early on in this sort of realm of secondary metabolites. So that's about all I have to say about this, except for two minor things. One, Joy, that this is published, and it is in the fourth, I think it's the fourth Cool Climate Symposium. But I think, as you've alluded to, all of this is in my enology notes, which is, I assume, where you got these slides.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Bruce, for going through that with us. And yeah, just to address that part of it, the transcript for your presentation at VVA, at VVA in 2000 was in enology notes. I dropped the PDF for that early on in the chat box. I understand that's sort of gone by. So once I get a chance, I'll drop that PDF again if anybody's interested. And then, as Bruce said, it is also published work, although it's a little hard for us to get a hold of without an academic library. So those are two different avenues. So maybe if someone's interested in seeing more of that, I understand Beth is on the call too, so she might be able to help once the libraries are open again. So, but thank you so much, Bruce, for telling us about that and just sort of bringing up that idea again that Brix are not telling the whole story necessarily in wine quality. And we'll make sure to touch back with you, Bruce, about that idea of the anthocyanin plateau and how that's correlating with wine quality. So to get back then to this idea of, one other one reason to do a crop load study is that we don't really have a set answer on how crop load is affecting wine quality. And we also have to realize that it doesn't come, it comes at considerable cost. So if we do sort of a cost benefit analysis here, 1 ton of Merlot, according to the Virginia Commercial Grape Report last year in 2019, 1 ton of Merlot averaged about $2,536. And so if we look at the difference in just grape pricing between 3 tons to the acre and 4.5 tons, that's a $3,800 difference in doing that crop thinning. So whatever we're looking at today, we need to realize that it comes at a cost. But also, if we can improve wine quality, there's a financial benefit to that. So let's say, if you decide to hang a higher crop and indeed have lower quality, you may be able to, for example, make some kind of a table wine out of that, one of those blends that's sort of your low level red blend that is kind of that $20 bottle. But if you're able to instead, with some great vineyard management, push that crop to produce a reserve level wine that, say, you could sell for about $30 a bottle. And to sort of come up with that number, I looked on a number of your websites, and lots of your varietal and reserve wines are selling at least for $30, if not more. So if we sort of back calculate to say how much of an overall difference in revenue would that be, that's about $12,000. So it does matter. Wine quality does come out in a bottle price if we can make a reserve level wine off of that and sell that bottle for more. But it does come as a cost if we're not actually getting the quality out of it. So that's sort of the big broad picture background of why do a crop load study. But as I said at the beginning, Joseph was the one that brought this to me. And so I'm going to sort of turn over to Joseph now and say, Joseph, when you wanted to do a crop load study at Trump, what were the things that you were thinking about? What are the reasons that you wanted to do this study, and what were the goals you had for it?
All right. Well, thanks, Joy, and thanks for putting this together. Certainly, I think a cool alternative, and you may be onto something. So anyhow, but I think you made a lot of good points on why we're interested in a crop load study. Economics is one of those big things. Like, we have these sort of canopy management protocols and crop level management protocols that we sort of go through. And is it worth it? Was one of the main questions. Is it worth taking the time and dropping the crop, and are we getting any substantial ripening enhancement from it? Are we getting any substantial quality enhancement from it? And as far as like ripening numbers aside, like fruit chemistry aside and phenolics aside, if we look at 2018 and some of the reasoning for the 2019 study, which is coming off of a bad year in 2018. We had Hurricane Florence. It was tough on some of our red varietals. So the idea was also to look at disease resistance and susceptibility, because that can be a huge thing right there. If you don't have your crop rotting on you, then at least you have sound fruit every year. So that's something we're looking at and we'll continue to look at. We're not hoping for a rainy season, but obviously this past season we didn't have that data because it was very dry the whole time. So, but certainly another one of those goals is to look at disease. So that was a big one. You can go to the next slide there.
Yeah, and so why did you want to do this on the Merlot block?
Right, and as far as choosing Merlot and why Merlot, the slide kind of helps me out too. But it's typically naturally cropping itself between 4 to 5 tons per acre without any type of adjustment, right? So, and what we would see there is, and Merlot just tends to be heavy anyhow with its big clusters. So anyway, naturally we were getting between 4 and 5 tons to the acre. There's kind of this like, as far as a lot of industry information goes, the higher quality between 2.5 and 3.5. So we wanted to look at is our canopy management worth it for our crop adjustments? Because typically we're trying to get it below 4. We've seen some color ripening issues in areas where maybe we haven't been as detailed with our crop drop or the crop management, whatever. So certainly there's some maturity issues when we were seeing higher crops in the Merlot, some discoloration and things like that. So that's one of the main reasons we chose Merlot, is just like its varietal characteristics, kind of a bigger bunch. It naturally tended to crop itself heavier.
Okay. And then tell us when and how did you actually get to the crop load itself? How did you decide? When did you do your cluster thinning?
Can you go to the next slide? I think there's one more.
Yep, it's on there.
Thank you. So as far as achieving the different levels, so first of all, we only did 2, and future studies maybe we do 3. And I know we looked at doing even maybe some different some more separation between tons per acre. But anyhow, we got a high crop load of 4.5 tons per acre, and this is basically like minimal crop management. It's basically like a disease compaction drop. So any of the big, large shoulders or wings were removed on bunches. The stuff that's kind of touching out and reaching out and touching the neighboring bunch, all that was removed. And if there's an area of stacked bunches, maybe we have like a grouping of 3 bunches in one area, we would cut the one in the middle out. So just like a disease drop was like our industry standard. And then for the like low crop level treatment to try to achieve 3 tons to the acre, we targeted 1.5 clusters per shoot, which basically just means we were on like a 2-1, 2-1 alternating type thinning. So 2 clusters per shoot, 1 cluster per shoot, 2 clusters per shoot, 1 cluster per shoot. Whereas the higher crop load just got 2 clusters per shoot. So anyway, managing the cluster number like that led us to get 2 separate crop levels. And then, even looking forward for the future, we'll probably do 1 cluster per shoot for the low crop load and be even more drastic. But here's some pictures here. Low crop load on top, high crop load on the bottom, and you can just see some of the color variation there, and you can see where the heavier bunches are stacked. Obviously, they're further behind. So this was like, I think, a month out from harvest, something like that.
Yeah, so I actually took these pictures. These were taken when Tim and I came out to put flags on. So it was right when you were starting your ripening sampling. So we were there July 31st. So, okay, well, thank you so much, Joseph, for that. So as I said at the beginning, when we set out to do this study, Joseph was willing to take a lot of samples so that we could get some robust data. And in order to set that up, I asked Tim Jordan if he would come in and do some and basically set up the treatment blocks within the vineyard, so that we could take the right samples to be able to do some statistical analysis on the other side of that. So Tim, can you tell us just a little bit about how you set up the blocks within the vineyard, how many you had, where they were, and what the sampling regime looked like? And I'll give you a slide for that.
Sure. Yeah, thank you, Joy, for letting me participate in this study. And just to plug that we are trying to recruit more vineyard experiments for this year. And Joseph did a really great job with all of his sampling. It turns out he took over 100 samples, 100 different fruit samples over the course of a couple of weeks. So it's a lot of work, but it can be very rewarding with the amount of data that we collect. So I have my assistant, Teddy. She's 1 year old, and I am daddy daycare for the foreseeable future. And if she happens to have anything to say or do, if my computer shuts down or whatever, I'll come back. All right, so with Trump, I wasn't really familiar with the block to begin with, but I was given an overview aerial photograph of the block and how it was laid out. And so what I tried to do was establish zones of homogeneity within the block. And so we created 4 different blocks within the overall Merlot block, situated from basically east to west, and the slope of that Merlot block was facing approximately east. And I'm sorry, I've got this little hand in my face. And what we did was we just tried to make sure that all the treatment blocks were approximately the same, and trying to address any of the variability that might be encountered in that vineyard block. So our primary independent variable, which we've talked about, was crop load, and it was a qualitative variable because the crop load that we finally got to was just basically a numerical value that we couldn't really control until we got to it. And so we're looking at both a high and low crop load. And then our various dependent variables were clusters per vine, various maturity sampling metrics, and then a harvest sampling date. Let's go on to the next slide, Joy.
There you go.
All right, so Joseph very successfully was able to differentiate the crop between the two different treatments. As shown here, it basically boils down to a number of pounds per linear foot. This Merlot block is planted pretty densely, around 2,000 vines per acre. So if you're to take those different pounds per foot out, you can arrive at a certain crop load per acre. While the crop loads were different, they were approximately, it wasn't roughly that 50% more crop in the high, although it was close. All right, let's move on. So with the upcoming charts, we didn't really encounter any significant results, and we weren't really expecting any necessarily, but I'll just draw your attention to the fact that when I talk about a significant blocking effect or a significant weak effect, those are important from an analysis and interpretation standpoint, but they're really not the meat of what we're looking at. So while I say that with the maturity sampling of bricks, that there was a significant blocking effect, as a scientist, that tells us, great, it's a good thing that we blocked, because if we didn't, then we would be losing some information. So as we would expect, bricks did change over the sampling periods, and but there was no significant difference between bricks among treatments. And if you were to look at bricks between treatments within each week, you're not going to see any significant differences either. Okay, let's move on to pH. Again, there was no significant difference between treatments, although we did see differences across weeks. In this situation, there was no blocking effect. However, that wasn't very important. And with TA, again, we saw the same thing, no difference between treatments. We did see differences across weeks, but no differences across the block. And lastly, for me and Teddy, we looked at berry weights as well. And while there was sort of a numerical difference that's pretty obvious between the two treatments, this was not a significant difference.
Okay. Thank you, Tim, and thank you, Teddy, for that. So just to recap there then, because Joseph took so many samples here, Tim was able to sort of sort through the variation in the vineyard itself to try to tease out what are meaningful, consistent, significant differences or not. And again, at this point, the only thing we've seen significantly different is the crop load itself, but none of these other major parameters look like they're different so far. So at this point, we kind of have to move away from that rigorous sampling methodology, because the analyses themselves start to get a little bit more expensive. So we were able to run phenolic analysis on the grapes for 3 of the 4 blocks for each treatment. So in this case, we can sort of see the range and the average of the values. And again, in this case, we can see that our low crop had slightly higher phenolic numbers for various different phenolics, notably our tannins and our anthocyanins. But when we think about what that variation looks like, the question is, how meaningful is that, and how much of that is just due to chance where those things are in the vineyard? So I pulled 2 of those out. When we look at tannin, for example, the high crop load tannin levels are really variable. You can look at that error bar and see how big that is. So because those error bars are overlapping, even though those look like very different average numbers, the variation there tells us that those aren't notably different at all. Our anthocyanin numbers, again, we have a pretty big variation in the anthocyanins for the low crop level. We have less overlap of those error bars. And so if there is a difference, we're more likely to have a difference there. But again, we can't say that that's significant based based on the information that we have. But that does give us a little clue to kind of keep our eye on what the color in the wine is doing, because those anthocyanins look like they're a little different. And I'm a little intrigued by Bruce's comment before about anthocyanins having some correlation to some of our other molecules. So certainly we would need to do a lot more work on that, but it's an interesting thing to put a pin in at this point. Okay, so at this point, the blocks were harvested, and when they were harvested, we were no longer keeping all of our treatment blocks separate. So instead of having 4 different vinifications for each treatment, those were treated all together for vinification. So we had 1 lot of the high crop and 1 lot of the low crop. So Jonathan, can you tell us a little bit about your winemaking on this wine? You have to unmute yourself.
Yes, sure, no problem. I mean, my role in this was to just try to keep everything as consistent as I possibly could. So even when we harvested the block, we were there were both the treatment and the control were harvested at the same day, same time. We alternated the rows, and we crushed them into the same size tanks. We did the same, same additions of, SO2 and enzymes. We did the same temperature, everything, the glycol cooling jackets, everything was the same yeast at the same rates. And basically I just tried to make this, as good of an experiment as we could to get the, as good of results. They were drain and press, fermentation. These are punch down tanks. So I was able to time the punch downs at the same time, at the same rate. So that's another good feature of this. I did do some pump overs as well during the fermentation, but that was done at the same rate. The drain and press in the same time, inoculated with the same strain of malolactic at the same time. And I barreled the majority of these down in French oak, but I chose to keep stainless steel for these lots, just so that we didn't have the influence of any oak. So they all completed the fermentations both happened pretty consistently. So I was pretty happy that I kept as good of an experiment as I could.
Yeah, great, thank you. Yeah, and if you want to know the experimental or the details there and what Jonathan did in all of his winemaking, again, that's in that full report. And again, I dropped it at the front. I'll drop it again at the back so that you can have access to that if you want to take a look at it. Okay, so in the end, yeah.
Just a comment I'd like to make as a point of reference. In addition to looking at cluster per vine, we also had some studies we're looking at clusters per shoot, as well as canopy architecture, and looking at both glycosides and those fractions that I mentioned before, as well as free volatiles. So when you go to repeat this study, it would be because of source sink relationships, I think it would be very interesting to look at single clusters per shoot.
At single clusters per shoot. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. We'll make sure to talk. We'll put that in the thing, and then we'll check back with you before we do it there. So as we sort of move, so at this point we're going to tell you which wine is which before I tell you the stuff about the chemistry. So on the information that you got in your box, it should have told you what group you were in. And if it didn't tell you what group you were in, you at least can look at the numbers here and figure out which wine is which of the ones that you tasted. So go ahead and figure out what that looks like for you. And I'm going to pour a little bit of wine of the one I tasted. Well, I give you a second for that. Okay, so as Jonathan said, he did a great job of keeping everything the same here. The first thing we'll look at is the fermentation kinetics, which look nearly identical. And that's a great thing for us in terms of comparing the wines. That means that when we're seeing differences, or if we see any differences, for example, in tannins or anthocyanins, then we know that that's not necessarily that we have the same maceration, the same temperature, And as he said, the same cap management regime there. So thank you, Jonathan, for being rigorous about that. So when we look at, yeah?
Did that last slide tell us which was the control and which was the treatment, or that was just so we know which group we were in?
I'm sorry, it says, yeah, so high and low, this one, Em?
Yeah. Oh, okay, okay, I got it now. Sorry.
Right.
I was looking
Okay,
at
yeah.
numbers. Okay, so if I'm in group 1, then 6,
Yeah.
8 is my different glass. Okay, got it.
Correct. Yeah, sorry, I'm
I'm the only
I should
slow
explain
one.
that better. Yeah. Okay, so any other questions about which wine you have in your glass? Okay. All right. So looking at juice chemistry, the juice chemistry looks nearly identical between the two lots. And then when we look at the basic wine chemistry, that also was very much the same between the two lots. So we're not seeing big differences in sort of those big measurements. When we look at the color of the wines, and this is basically just looked at through absorbance at 3 different wavelengths, we do see that the low crop has a higher intensity of color than our high crop does. Again, that's not a big difference, but we did have that difference or that almost difference in our anthocyanins. And so that we would think that we would be getting some difference there. So again, if we look at the raw numbers of that, we're looking at about 11.5 versus about 13.5 or almost 14 in the color intensity. But I guess my question would be, and we can kind of go back to this in just a minute when I can get the slides out of the way, but what did you notice in terms of color? So I'll come back and ask you that in just a minute.
What were the differences in the cofactors? Can you go back to the phenolic slide?
We can go to the wine cofactors in just a minute if you want.
Didn't you? Yeah, that's the one I was looking for.
Yeah. So in the grapes themselves, we have some slight differences.
You just mentioned
overall
you just
phenol,
measured
right?
the corset in that, and that's
Right.
okay.
That's all that the lab is measuring for us.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
So we will have a little bit of, but so Bruce, when we look at the wine phenolics, we do see again that
the point is most of the spectral color, at least more than a third, is a function of the cofactors, not the anthocyanin content.
Right. So maybe if we look at them together, then we do see that our low crop does have a little bit higher anthocyanins, but probably not what we would expect for that difference in intensity. In this case, at least what our phenolics we're measuring don't show a lot of difference there in the for example, the quercetin and glycoside and our caffeic and caphtoric acid. So they look pretty much the same in the wine itself. Okay, so, and like I said, you guys can look at those numbers, but in the end, the question is always, what is the sensory, right? There are some things that, let's see, there we go. There's everybody, there you go. So there are some things in the sensory that we're not gonna pick up with all of those numbers, and that's the whole point of you guys doing this whole, blind tasting of everything. So, so first of all, let's talk about whether or not you could tell the difference. So I'm not sure how to, usually I pull this in a room and look. So if you could maybe raise your hand, if you could tell the difference, and keep them raised because it'll take me a couple of minutes to go between all of the, okay. One more, let's see, here we go, raise your hand. Okay, so from my view, that looks like we're at about 50-50. So we'll have to actually do the statistics on that, and that's where I'll kind of come back and look at the things that you filled out to see. But for those of you that were able to tell the difference, what were some of the differences that you noticed in the wine? So at this point, you can go ahead and unmute yourself and just kind of speak in and let us know what are the things that tasted different for you or helped you to tell the difference in the wines.
Color.
Color, who was that?
That was Tim.
That was Tim. Okay, Tim, what did you notice about the color?
Pretty instantly, I noticed that the high treatment was less lighter hue and less intensity.
Okay, so you noticed that color difference. How about others? Did other people notice the color difference?
I did too, Joy. And also not just the intensity, but with the low treatment, it was just slightly more purple too. The hue was a little bit different.
Okay. Yeah, and I'll say the graph I show you doesn't show hue, but we can calculate hue, and that would be in the table. So we might be able to see a difference in that number too. Okay, other differences?
A greener alcohol character in the high crop load.
Greener alcohol character in the high crop load. So greener alcohol.
Methoxypyrazines, but it seemed to come through in the alcohol. It's hard to explain, but.
Okay, so in that case, like more of an herbal or green character, and it seemed like that was kind of coming up with that sort of volatile fraction of it.
Right.
Okay.
It seemed to
Because
kind
the
of
alcohol levels
mute
were
the
about the
fruit tone a little bit.
Pardon?
Seemed to kind of mute the fruit tone a little bit.
Okay. Okay. And that might be that interaction of the herbal character with fruit to mute that a little bit. Okay.
I got the on the low crop, the thing that differentiated it for me the most was almost a sensation of tar, a taste of tar, and a sensation of tar, more of a palate weight kind of thing. For the I thought of the weight of the higher crop load is lighter, and I don't know if I would call it muted or not, but the fruit was good in both of them. So that's my 2 cents.
Okay. Okay. Other impressions?
I felt like there was a noticeable difference if you were really paying attention and looking for the differences, which was something that, you know, this group is obviously doing. But I didn't find them to be so great. You could tell if you held it up to a piece of paper or if you really focused, but I didn't think it was as great as you would expect from a 33% crop reduction.
Okay. So to you,
the average consumer probably would not perceive any differences.
That's right.
Okay.
Which I think is important, particularly with regard to your economic review, Joy.
Yeah. Yes, we will definitely circle back to that. Okay.
Who's your friend there, Lee?
Yeah, I also have a friend. Her name is Lula.
Now, can I ask a question?
Yes.
These are the same wines that we tasted at the VVA meeting. Is that correct for the trial?
Yes, they are.
And I mean, I don't know if I remember this right or not, but I seem to remember a much more distinct difference since February than I do right now.
Okay.
Does that make any sense at all? Maybe
that
the
does.
wine
Well, that's actually
similar.
a pretty valid point. I mean, wine's not a static beverage, so yeah, depends on the evolution as to when you were evaluating it.
Because from my standpoint, it's like what Bruce was saying about the difference between what a consumer would notice and what we would notice is that I noticed that the higher crop load was the distinct difference that I noticed about the part that I liked about it was its lightness and its youth, and trying to extrapolate that into having a wine that was relatively older, which I thought that the lighter crop load or the low crop load would be more interesting as it developed and got older. But that was just something I was thinking about then. Now I don't know if that's the same thing where it would make that much of a difference in the long run with these wines.
Right, and I think that brings up a good point. And for those of you that weren't with us at VVA, we did taste these at VVA, but we didn't taste them blind. And when I tasted today, I went downstairs and told my husband, I was like, maybe it's when you're looking for the difference at VVA and you don't have all three of them, you don't realize how small that difference is because you're really trying to sort of convince yourself that they're different. And the impression it seemed in the room at the time was that there was a big difference. But from sort of our show of hands there, it looks like that might not be statistically significant. So one of the questions that came back then is exactly the one that we're talking about is this difference enough to kind of make you kind of take that financial loss to crop the fruit? And I think at this point I would go back to Jonathan and just say, Jonathan, this is your fruit. What do you normally do with the fruit that comes off of this vineyard? And what do you think about these two wines in terms of meeting the sort of goal of what you're intending for that fruit?
Yeah, sure. this is some of our premium Merlot that we use for both our 2 Bordeaux style blends. And obviously there are the economics involved in reducing crops. So I'm trying to make a balance between, you know, on our lower price point red versus our higher price point red to see what kind of difference it really makes. Personally, myself, I do find a difference. I don't think that they're huge. And this year, I guess I would like to continue this on our own, just because, you know, 2019 was such a different year, obviously. So maybe the difference is between this crop load study and something that, you know, we could do in 2020 could be a little bit more impactful. So I think that the low crop load gives you a little more dried fruit aromas. The high crop load gives you a little more fruit forward cherries and cherry notes that, you know, I like. And in our lower price point red, I think that the high crop load is completely, you know, it's great for this blend. So I'm really happy with both wines. And, you know, I'd like to just continue this study and just see if in a year with more, you know, disease pressure, that if we can actually get this, you know, these grapes off the vine in a healthy state, because obviously the number one is to get healthy fruit into the winery at the, you know, the highest quality we can. So.
Right. Yeah. So, so how about you all out there in the gallery window? What do you think in terms of the difference in the wine, given the difference in the economics that you're looking at for that wine?
Well, I would just say that as a vineyard manager, my goal is to bring to the winery healthy, non-diseased fruit. And so I thin based on spacing and trying to make sure that they're not, especially Merlot, is not on top of each other. And what I think of is a good crop load. And, you know, for example, last year, we dropped a lot of crop and still came in at about 4.5 tons an acre. So I don't know what our real load was before we took a lot off. But it's also the season, and if there's a lot of rain, and you know, we just got to loosen it up a little bit. So I would say that it's not the differences between the two. You know, if I'm trying to make money, I don't think that I would want to bring it down to that smaller crop load, you know, because if you can sell that at the same price point, that most customers won't notice, you know. And I tell that to Stephen all the time. He'll be doing finding trials, and I'll say, yeah, I can tell this difference, but who cares? That person down there, he's not going to know. Most people won't be able to tell the difference. So.
Anyway, yeah, I think it's a good point that you make there. I do think too that there's the flip side of that, in that like getting from good to great is also a series of a bunch of tiny little steps that all add up to great, even when each tiny little step may or may not, you know. So there's that question too of the added effect on either side. If I add one more thing, or if I take away one more thing, what's the additive effect of all of those things? So that is certainly something that is going to be a vineyard by vineyard and winemaker by winemaker decision about what's the overall goal for those wines. So any other comments on your sensory impressions of this wine before we wrap things up? Anything else? Okay, so before we go, then just a couple of things. Again, you know, just in conclusion, you know, we did see that we didn't see large differences in our basic chemistry. We saw some sort of minor differences, potentially in color and potentially, but again, we would need more information to make hard and fast decisions on that. As many people have brought up, you know, this is very much a vintage driven question. So the question remains, what would happen in 2018 versus 2019, and what might happen in 2020? So it's important with these kinds of studies that we do multiple years of those. And I'm excited to hear that Joseph and Jonathan would be willing to do this again, even though there's so many little berries to pick off. We really do appreciate their willingness to keep going forward with that. And as Tim said, this is something that we would really love to see other people looking at as well, or looking at your vineyard, whatever questions you have in your vineyard. So as you're kind of moving into that next stage of things out there, if there are questions that you're interested in looking at in a little bit more detail, we would love to come alongside you and help you to kind of put those questions into good experimental questions and design what that sampling regime would look like. The other thing I think I feel is important is to say that what happens with one variety isn't necessarily what we would expect with another variety at the same time. So I talked to a number of people about Cabernet Franc last week, and some of the decisions, for example, you might make with Merlot might be different with Cabernet Franc just because of some of the propensity for vegetative growth and for methoxypyrazine production and those sorts of things. So as with everything, we need to be careful about the applications of this. And in a lot of cases, that is, I think, why you do your own study on your own fruit in your own vineyard, to see what that's looking like in your particular situation. So Rick, you raised your hand just a second ago. Did you have something you wanted to say?
Yeah, it's just I'm kind of curious, and it's a generally curious. Have you found that the weather is going to affect any of these experiments that you guys have planned out, particularly for people down in the Charlottesville area?
We haven't committed to any experiments for next year at this point. Our funding still is in limbo because everything got delayed. So we can't technically commit to experiments until we know something about what that looks like for next year. But we have certainly already had some discussions of, maybe next year, if a vineyard has, intermittent damage throughout the vineyard, certainly that just adds more complexity into trying to tease out, that variation in the vineyard. So it will certainly go into design of any experiments to say, like, what does the block look like? Is this the year to do that? Is there maybe a small section of the block we could use, or is it, was it relatively unaffected? So certainly, Rick, it's a great point. It will definitely affect vineyard or design of any vineyard experiments going forward if it did get some frost damage.
Cool.
So.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you all so much. I know we went a little bit over the hour that we had planned, but thank you so very, very much for coming today. Thank you for doing your sensory analysis and your continued interest and support for the WRE. I will stay on for a while if anybody has additional questions or feedback. I think I would really love to hear from folks if you are willing to do this again, if you think this is a good venue to do some things until we're able to come back together again.